This is a look at some philatelic tributes to Alexander von Humboldt. If you were to ask a general group of people who was the most famous scientist of the 20th century, I think you'd get a consensus of Albert Einstein. If you were to ask that same question in about 1820 in Europe or in North or South America, I think the answer would be Alexander von Humboldt. He is to a great extent forgotten now, but his achievements were significant and they really caught the imagination of the public. He was from Germany, Prussia to be specific. There was no Germany per se in at the turn of the 19th century. His brother, he was from a wealthy family. His brother was, in fact, a diplomat for the state of Prussia. He got very interested in biology, botany, geology, things like that. And he was really a polymath. He knew all kinds of things about many, many scientific topics. And he had enough money to finance what he wanted to do. In 1799, he asked the crown of Spain, may I go and make an expedition in your American territories? The Spanish were notorious for not letting anyone except Spaniards onto their colonial territory. But he persuaded them that his intentions were entirely scientific, and he got enthusiastic support from a few other Spaniards who were similarly interested. And he then went on a 4 to 5 year trip to South and Central America. Here is quickly the route he took from La Coruña in Spain to Venezuela, up the Orinoco River, back down again to Cuba, from Cuba to New Granada, which is now essentially Colombia, down west of the Andes to Ecuador and Peru. I guess there was no Ecuador at this time. Peru was the general administrative district for that part of South America for Spain. Over to Mexico, back to Cuba, and decided to go back to Europe. But he had heard of Thomas Jefferson, who was then president, and his interest in botany. And he decided to stop and visit Jefferson. And they spent several days together. So the first stop was Venezuela, which is honored in this set from 1959. He decided to see if he could find the source of the Orinoco River, which actually, as I say here, pretty much unknown to the world, but it discharges the fourth largest amount of fresh water into the ocean. In any case, the Orinoco, the source of it was unknown, even though people had lived in Venezuela, the coast mostly, for centuries. There's a shot of the river itself, and you can see how remote, you can sense anyway, how remote this place is. On the map, yeah, this is the Orinoco River. It empties into what's known as Boca Grande, or Big Mouth, named after a friend of mine. He went as far as he could. He didn't get to the source. Interestingly enough, when you finally get to the beginning of the Orinoco River, you are in an area where the water mostly flows to the Amazon. About 100 years later, a very famous American made a trip up the Amazon to see if he could find the source of one of the tributaries, not the Orinoco, which is not a tributary to the Amazon. Do you have any idea who I'm talking about? Theodore Roosevelt. After he left the White House, he was obviously a very restless individual, and he thought that he ran for president again in 1912 with the Bull Moose Party. That didn't succeed, and he wanted to just get away from politics. So he went down to Brazil, up the Amazon, and tried to find the source of I think the Rio Negro is what it was called. In so doing, he contracted terrible diseases. He was for a while delirious. Many people at the time would have said that he was delirious normally, just to begin with. Can you imagine Teddy Roosevelt being delirious? There must have been something incomprehensible. What I learned in doing this was that near the Orinoco, if I circle right where it says Venezuela, I didn't realize this. This is a series of very high mountains. I thought the only significant, and boy, are they significant, mountains in South America were the Andes. But these are also huge mountains. You can see the elevation there of Mount Roraima, that's nearly 3,000 meters or 2 miles high. And there's another one down here, Nabina Peak, over 3,000 meters high. Again, these mountains are 2 miles high. That's why so much water pours into the Orinoco. This is just about the rainiest part of the planet. Colombia, if you look at a list of rainy countries, Colombia is number one. He went on to Cuba, and his work there was so important that he's often referred to as the second discoverer of Cuba. And Cuba has honored him time and again. Years after making the trip to Cuba, he wrote a book about his experience, and he described Cuba from the geographical point of view, its climate, its flora and fauna, of course. That was his greatest interest, its mineral deposits and so on. And he included a really scathing condemnation of the fact that the economy was entirely based on slavery. From Cuba, he went to New Granada, now known as Colombia. The borders, of course, are not exact, but that's where it is. And they honored him again in 1959. 59 was the 100th anniversary of his death. I get a kick out of this set because he's depicted there with a bunch of animals, including a spider monkey, an anteater, and a sloth. If someone put me on a series of stamps with that as company, I would think they're trying to tell me something.
Well, we're just another species.
Yes, indeed. Then he went on to the Andes, to Quito and to Lima, Peru. Lima, of course, was the large city for Western South America. It was established way back the early 1500s. It's the site, I believe, of the oldest university in the Americas. While in Ecuador, he attempted to climb to the top of Mount Chimborazo, which at that time was considered the highest mountain in the world. The height of the Himalayas were not known.
It may be the highest because I think it starts at a very low level. So there's a great deal of height to gain to get to its summit. Unlike like Mount Everest starts at 9,000 feet or something.
That's a really good point. I didn't know that, but yes, I've heard that. I can tell you one thing that is fascinating about this attempted ascent to the top is that they didn't reach it. He was a few people with him. When he came back down, he realized that he had, of all humans that had ever existed, he had gone furthest above sea level, even including people who had taken balloon rides and so on. From there, he went on to Mexico. Mexico honors him time and again. He was particularly known in Mexico, not only for his investigations of flora and fauna, but also because he knew so much about geology that he was useful to the mining interests there. On the way back, as I mentioned, he stopped to see President Jefferson, and the United States has honored him by doing nothing. Naturally, Germany has honored him time and time again. East Germany, West Germany, Berlin, and unified Germany, on and on. They're very proud of this guy, as I think they should be. 1957 to 58 was known as the International Geophysical Year, and countries all over the world celebrated. People say, I haven't verified this, that when the Soviets sent up Sputnik, it was as part of their participation in International Geophysical Year, 57 to 58. 1959 was a mini version of that. Countries left and right honored Humboldt for his achievements. Again, it was the 100th anniversary of his death. Here he is, in particular, on a Russian stamp. After he came back from the Americas, many years later, he led expedition, that could be plural, I'm not sure, uh, into Russia as Russia was expanding north and east. The 1900s, of course, were an era of enormous expansion for certain countries: Canada, the United States, and Russia. The other European powers expanded adjacent territory. Many things have been named in his honor. Probably the most important is the Humboldt Current in the Pacific Ocean, just west, essentially, of Peru. I didn't realize this until I read Rachel Carson a few years ago. Our weather and our climate depends enormously on ocean currents. Britain, for instance, which is really quite far north, would have frozen cold winters like, say, Quebec, if it wasn't for the Gulf Stream. The Humboldt Current does something similar to South America. There is one stamp in the Scott catalog with the name Humboldt on it, the Scott United States catalog. And that is from the Humboldt Express, which was a private mail service in Nevada. And it ran naturally in Humboldt County. But I find it interesting. Again, my interest in stamps is very closely allied to that of history. And at times like these, it's reassuring to come across a really remarkable, wonderful guy and a brilliant scientist like Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt is often considered the first real environmentalist because he connected climate with what kind of plants were there. I mean, we all do in a sense. We know you're not going to grow blueberries in the Sahara, but he got it down to a real scientific level, including, for instance, ocean currents, the amount of rainfall, latitude, longitude, such things as that.
He had a brother,
Yes,
Wilhelm, who was
yes,
also, he's even less famous than Alexander nowadays, but among philologists, he is well remembered, right?
that's right. That's right.
Yes.
And he was a very successful diplomat. This was a time when, under Napoleon and a few people later, much to their regret, probably, they were beginning to unify Germany, whether Germany wanted it or not. It was a collection of something like 40 principalities. I forget
Mhm.
the number. But Napoleon began to consolidate them. Napoleon was not only a great, obviously, general, strategic thinker, but he also was a great administrator. He couldn't stand sloppiness. To this day, the Code Napoleon is still the basis of French law.
There's
Wonderful.
also a Humboldt County in California. So I assume that must have been named after him. Did he ever visit California, the coast?
No, he never did. His only trip to the U.S. was to visit Jefferson, just for a couple of weeks,
I
Philadelphia and
see.
Washington. Uh,
Okay.
I guess that's why he's not ever been honored on a U.S. stamp. Uh,
So how did that place in Nevada come to be named after him?
well, one thing I read was that later German immigrants into the United States were fond of naming places for people from
Okay.
the old country, and Humboldt's name was used often. Chicago is loaded with Humboldt avenues and parks and
Hmm.
so on. There's a statue of Humboldt in New York City, facing the Museum of Natural History. No one knows it's there because it's kind of hiding behind trees at this point. But
Hmm.
it's a bust. It's not a full statue, as I recall. But he was probably, after Napoleon Bonaparte, in his lifetime, Humboldt was probably the European whom more people could identify. As I say, his reputation has faded considerably now.
There was a book written about him a few years ago. Um, Andrea Wolf, I think, is the name of the writer.
In researching this, I came across a book written recently. Maybe we're talking about the same book.
Hmm.
Uh, this individual had it in mind to sort of debunk a lot of the what he considered hype around Humboldt. And at the end of it, everyone who reviewed it said, "This guy Humboldt was greater than I ever realized."